Almitakiapi, Shante Washte, Napachiuzapi, Patrice Kunish Imachiapi. Good day, my relatives. I greet you with a warm handshake and heart. My name is Patrice Kunish, and I am the Commissioner of the Administration for Native Americans in the Department of Health and Human Services. It has been our unfortunate legacy that Indigenous peoples have experienced severe collective intergenerational trauma, along with ongoing discrimination, racism, and oppression. Cultural and regional differences among tribes influence how this trauma is experienced and addressed. Scientific evidence show that our communities experience intergenerational responses to this collective trauma and loss that inform methods to alleviate our psychological suffering and unresolved grief. This webinar discusses how trauma impacts our lived experiences and our capacity to cope with that stress and trauma. The webinar also discusses the research and clinical innovations aimed at addressing this trauma. The native speakers delve into the historical context of intergenerational trauma by sharing their firsthand experiences, which vividly illustrate trauma's tragically enduring impact on so many of our peoples. The speakers emphasize ongoing challenges related to trauma responses, community unity, and cultural identity, giving rich context to the critical importance of understanding this trauma and recognizing its intergenerational effects. We then shift to hope and highlighting current evidence-based practices and treatment. Here, the speakers share research and clinical innovations aimed at addressing historical trauma among Indigenous peoples as we continue to survive and thrive in strength and unity.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cassidy Blankenship, and I'm the Communications Specialist here at the Alaska Region TTA Center. It is my pleasure to introduce our first two speakers, Susan and Jim LaBelle. Susan was born and raised in the village of Port Graham, Alaska, Sugpiaq, Dene, and Filipino ancestry. Spent 4 years at government boarding school, bachelor's degree in social work in 1984, master's degree in social work in 1997, retired after more than 35 years in the helping profession, past member and president for the National Association of Social Work, NASW for short, the Alaska chapter. Governor appointee as past trustee to the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority, AMHTA for short. Retired professor with the University of Alaska in the School of Social Work, married to Jim LaBelle, Sr., 4 adult children and 7 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. Enrolled tribal member of the native village of Port Graham. Jim LaBelle Sr. is an Indian boarding school survivor of 2 BIA boarding schools, Wrangell Institute Elementary and Mount Edgecombe High School. Jim is also a Vietnam-era veteran of the U.S. Navy. From January 1967 to June 1970, he was honorably discharged. Jim is currently retired and previously served as an assistant term professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage from 2003 to 2011. During his time there, he taught at both the College of Arts and Science in Alaska Native Studies and at the College of Business and Public Policy. Additionally, Jim taught classes at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Department of Alaska Native and Rural Development, as well as the Nome campus and for the Alaska Pacific University, Alaska Native Leadership Program. Jim has 20 years of experience working in Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act Village and regional corporations in several management and leadership capacities, including serving as the president of Port Graham and as chairman of the board for Chuyak Regional Corporation. Jim also has work and consulting experience for the oil and gas industry. Jim has served as a community development specialist, local government specialist for the Department of Regional and Community Affairs for the state of Alaska from 1988 to 1990. He's also served as a rural affairs coordinator to the Alaska Department of Corrections from 1995 to 1999. Jim has served on a number of regional, statewide, and national organizations, including the National Native Boarding School Healing Coalition, From 2017 until present, the Alaska Federation of Natives, the Chugiak Alaska Corporation, the Regional Citizens Advisory Council, Prince William Sound, Sea Stories of Anchorage, and Bridge Builders of Anchorage. Jim and Susan have been married since June 1969, have 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Jim is enrolled in the native village of Port Graham.
Jamaka ay, good afternoon. My name is Susan LaBelle. I am Sukbek, my Tene and Filipino, originally from the village of Port Graham. I'm an enrolled member. I was born and raised in the village. I was named after my grandmother who had passed away before me. And what life was like growing up in a tiny village. My mother died in my early life from TB. There was a TB epidemic going on. So I was raised up by my aunts and uncles, my extended family all around me. So I was able to remain in a village and not taken out of the village, taken to foster care or adopted out. My father was still living, but he was busy fishing and trapping. Life was quite simple those days. There wasn't a lot of life conveniences like we have today. We didn't have running water or electricity. So, and we had a one-room school, the elementary school that we attended from the time we were 6 years old until the 8th grade. The school was really small, as our village was tiny little place located in South Central Alaska. However, life in the school was different because we were not allowed to speak our languages, which was mainly Sukbek language, and were punished if anyone was caught uttering a word. School in a village, pretty much we were done by the 8th grade and had to be sent out. It was not a choice to be sent away. I was sent to Wrangell Institute in Southeast Alaska, it took about 4 airplanes to get there. I was only 15 years old and off I went all by myself, much as I had wanted to go to Mondegum with my brother and my best friend. We weren't given choices. The problem back then was lack of choices. You didn't have a choice to go here or there or what you can do. Pretty much the BIA controlled our life. So being forced to go to school was very life-changing. Arriving in Wrangell was a little shocking, as I had never been in an institution or had no idea what I was going into. I think later Jim will talk about the situation, what it was like in life in a dorm, but what was common back, even though we had gone at different times, what was common is that once you arrived at the boarding school, you had to remove all your clothing and put on government issued clothing. And then we were having to live by the bell, to line up for everything, to go to the meals, to go to bed, to get up. We were assigned a number. We weren't called by our names, but by our numbers, which seems to be a common theme among boarding school survivors. So that was just part of the changes. One of the things I really missed about home was part of the life was the meals were quite different. In Wrangell, we were fed very different meals. Like we had powdered milk, powdered eggs. It was horrible tasting food, but we had to eat, and we only had a few minutes to eat, and it was not good tasting food. And I remember the dining monitor who monitored and made sure I ate everything on my tray. that was quite a weird experience because I was always a problem eater back home where I wasn't a fast eater. I was slow, but I got through that year. It was a difficult year because there was one of the things was lacking was communication with family and village. The only thing that came through was an occasional letter because so many of my relatives could not read or write and missing during the time we were at Wrangell Institute. We were not allowed to go home for any holidays or events such as funerals or visits. So we're at the facility 9 months out of the year. One of the things I have heard about, sadly, is to hear of all the harm that was done to children in the earlier years, that when I didn't experience any abuse when I was there, but I did witness an incident that had really impacted me in a way. It traumatized me for life. I have never forgotten. One of the other things that was missing is the cultural activities. Besides I had no one else to speak Sukhtun to because I was the only Sukpet person there. So language was primarily English for me, but there wasn't any cultural activities that was encouraged or supported or practiced, and very little communication, just letters, because we didn't have telephones back in the villages back then. So it was the biggest impact to me about boarding school was the major losses that I experienced during my time away from home. I had not known about. My first major one was to discover when I returned home and I asked for my grandfather and learned that he had gotten ill and passed away. That was really a big negative impact on me. And then my second year in boarding school, I learned that my aunt and uncle who had raised me died in a plane crash. One of the plans they had was to fly to a town to search for a house or have a house built so that my brother and I wouldn't have to go to boarding school, but they died in a plane crash. So a lot of grief and loss and separation issues occurred those years, even though the boarding school era ended in 75. A lot of residuals still remain from those years. And I've seen that in the work that I've done. I've been retired for 14 years as a social worker back in the 80s and 90s. I worked in the family services area because my main interest was children and families, and doing much work as I could to support, encourage, and help families that were struggling to get healthy and get stronger. Back in the early 80s was the implementation of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So a couple of us worked really hard to work on keeping families intact, trying to efforts at reunification, much time spent in court hearings as a witness, and much of the work was to build support systems for young mothers. We had many young mothers referred to us who needed support, and we built a kind of a group to give them a sense of community, to come together to get support with their babies. Many of them also were referred from the hospital when the babies were born. And so we were fortunate enough back then to have a group of older Native women to serve as family aides to the mothers and their children, and built kind of activities that were appropriate for that group. One of my greatest feeling of being a social worker and working with children and families is to help children, babies thrive, and to see the families grow. It was my greatest reward. We still have many of those kinds of issues today. Although I'm not working in the field, I have heard still about the disproportionate rates of suicide, substance abuse, domestic violence, the incarceration rate, the children in foster care. I think the last I heard, the rate was at 60% of children in state custody are Native children, but yet our own whole state Native population is about 20%, I believe. So there's still much work to be done, a lot of healing. We encourage wherever we are to promote healing and help providers to become more trauma informed. It's important. One of the things I learned from my family in early life was to never forget where you came from and where you're going. So that always stuck with me to help young families, especially in parenting groups, to learn their traditional ways of raising children. That is something I've observed that was very effective. Even grandmothers came to our parenting classes to learn about being a parent, a grandparent, and getting support from each other. But there's more ways, and it's wonderful to hear all the efforts that are going on today, a lot of resources that are available. Back when we were doing family work in the 80s and 90s, there was very little resources available. But fortunately, we have more of those available now that families can count on. And now I will hand it over to Jim for his part.
Hi, my name is Akpayuk. I'm an Inupiaq. My Inupiaq name means fast runner. I was named after an uncle who passed away before I was born, and this is our way of remembering someone in our family, in our lineage. And I'm grateful for that name. My English name is Jim LaBelle. I'm a product of a mixed race marriage. My father was white from Wisconsin, and my mother was from Kotzebue, above the Arctic Circle on the Bering Sea coast. My father passed away when I was about 6 years old, so we became of immediate interest to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who essentially forced my mother to make a decision back in early 1955 to either send your children away to boarding school or have them adopted to a white family. And she chose to send us to Wrangell Institute, which was one of the most notorious BIA-run boarding schools in Alaska, with the understanding that at least she thought that we would be together in the summertime. And one of the reasons for that, I believe, as I look back on what happened, I was only 8 years old, my brother was 6, was that our mother was an alcoholic, in the small town of Fairbanks at the time. The word must have gotten out to authorities about my mother's drinking and being neglectful of myself and my brother. In the fall of 1955, our mom took us out to the airport in Fairbanks and with tearful apology and that we had to go away. And then she'll see us in the spring. And that was very much all we understood about why we're leaving. And we had no understanding of what we were to be expecting. When we got to the airport in Fairbanks, there were already children there from other parts of Alaska and other villages that were waiting at the airport, and the BIA officials immediately tied my brother and I up to the other children who were already tied together with rope. And then the first thing they did after tying us up was they put a yellow name tag with our name on it, our destinations, our flights, that kind of thing. And if you can imagine just a sea of little children, 5 years old and up to 12, 13, waiting for flights to Wrangell, which became an annual event for many, many years. It preceded me, and it continued after I left Wrangell 6 years later. I can still remember children almost not believing where they were. Some of them were rocking back and forth in their chair. Some had their eyes closed. Some were trying to blink out the world, I think. Then we were put on the transportation of the day. It was these old DC-3s, which they call tail draggers, and transportation was pretty primitive back in the mid 1900s, and many of us had never been on aircraft like that before, and it just added to the terror that we were experiencing. Already other children were already expressing the look of trauma on their faces, having already moved hundreds of miles away to Fairbanks for the next leg of our trip. And of course, then we flew to Anchorage, and we were met again at the airport with other children that were coming from other parts of Alaska. So the sea of children was even greater, and it took about almost 2 days to get to our destination. We had to go from Anchorage to Juneau. We were then parceled out into smaller seaplanes. That was also a new experience of having to take off and land on the water. And Southeast Alaska is a very mountainous and tree-lined place, and many of my fellow travelers had come from tundra villages where there were no trees or mountains, and to see that for the first time just added to the terror that these children were facing. When we finally got to Wrangell itself, we were met at the town of Wrangell, where the aircraft powered up onto land, and we were immediately put on buses and taken 5 miles out of town to this campus called Wrangell Institute. There, the demeanor, the the way we were treated, the way the workers, the VI officials, matrons, all changed. They were very businesslike. They were very harsh. They hustled us along. They had made orders for us to do this and do that, and a lot of children who only spoke their own language had no understanding of what those commands were. Since my brother and I also spoke English, we got a good sense of what was being asked of us, and I guess instinctively we helped the other children to go to this area or that way or to do different things. At the campus, the girls and the boys were separated, and where they went to the girls' dorm, the boys, we went to the boys' dorm and into a large receiving room, which is a multi-purpose room, where the first order of the day was to get completely undressed. And if you can imagine dozens of little children being ordered to get totally undressed in the front of other strange children and other strange people in the room, I know is pretty daunting even for me to be in a place where we were totally disrobed, and they confiscated all of our belongings. There were some children who came wearing their traditional clothing, and those eventually got taken away and burned. And we were later issued government clothing. The second order of the day was to line up in a row and face the barber. The barber had an electric machine, hair cutting machine, and he did pretty fast work. He mowed us all down until we were bald. I can still remember a couple of years, some of the years being toward the end of the line, and as I got closer to this barber, naked again, we were all still naked. The hair was piling up on his feet on the floor. All of this served to do in the first, for the most youngest ones, was to just add to the trauma that we were experiencing. The third order of the day was to go upstairs into and line up to go into an open shower room that had spigots sticking out. The water was flowing, hot water. Many children, and even people like myself, and who grew up in Fairbanks, never saw this kind of bathing experience before, with a big open room and hot water spigots, coming out of the wall. We were all given live soap and a washcloth. We had to walk through a chemical pan that was on the floor just in front of the shower. I remember that the feeling on my feet when I put my feet in that solution was very caustic and it burned. In the shower room, we did our best as little guys to bathe ourselves. A lot of children didn't do that. They didn't know how to, because most likely their mothers did that for them. I can still remember one matron being really pissed off and running in there, getting himself all wet, taking a floor brush, rubbing some lye soap across it, and literally scrubbing a kid until parts of his skin bled, as an example to the rest of us that we needed to bathe ourselves or face that same experience as that other little kid did. You can imagine the silence that continued all the way from the beginning of our trip to our destination, to the receiving room. A lot of us couldn't speak each other's languages, and so we couldn't really communicate very well with each other. And that same silence occurred in the shower room, with the only sound that we were hearing was the sound of the noise the water made coming out of the walls. And there was about 10 or 12 spigots coming out. There was a whole bunch of us little kids in there. The next thing we were given was clothing, government issued clothing, as I mentioned. This time it had our numbers were given to us that were also written on with indelible ink on the clothing. And this particular numbering system allowed the mass washing of laundry and stuff, and associating the numbers with who they belong to from a roster. It made it pretty convenient for matrons to begin only referring to many of us only by our number and not by our given name. Some of our names were difficult to pronounce. They were indigenous names. So it made it convenient for the matrons to begin just calling us by our number. Heaven help you if you forgot your number because you were punished and you were sternly reminded that this is your number. And it was a 2-digit number. And by the time I got to Wrangell, they started issuing these 2-digit numbers, a new one every year. I heard prior to my being there at Wrangell that other children only had one number for the number of years they were there. I don't understand why they changed it, but I do remember I had 6 sets of 2-digit numbers that I had to remember. It also corresponded with the mail that any kind of correspondence that was coming in or information that needed our attention. We were sent to a barrack style dormitory. There was a large center, kind of a bench line there, and then on 2 sides of that were these open-ended rooms that could go from one room to the next. Each room had 4 or 5 bunk beds in it, so anywhere from 8 to 10 children were in each room. But I think the average number was 4 bunk beds, so there were 8 of us children. The most littlest ones got the bottom bunks, of course, and some of us got the upper beds. And that evening was our first night at lights out in the dark, and it didn't take very long for one little guy to start crying and whimpering and almost like he was grasping for air. And he was hollering and whispering or saying mama, and it caught on, and other children started whimpering and crying as well, and it grew into the night, and it wasn't long before the entire little boys' dorm was just kind of wailing into the night, and we cried ourselves to sleep. The next morning we woke up, we had our eyelids were crusted shut from all of those tears. And it repeated itself for many weeks and even a few months into the school year. But it slowly diminished. If you're a parent and you know instinctively to go to your child and care for that little girl, that little boy, and comfort them, tell them they were loved, they were cared for, they were held. But this didn't happen at Wrangell Institute. No one came for us. No one consoled us. And it didn't take very long for many of us to just become a little hard-hearted about what is the use of crying if no one comes to hold us and to tell us we're okay. And there was that very separation, a very strong separation between our families and that sterile institution that we were put into. devoid of affection. The next morning, we were sent off to. First we had to learn how to make our beds, which for some of us we had to do it in such a way as that you could actually make a quarter bounce off your bed, or get some kind of demerit for it if you didn't. We had to learn how to wash up in the bathroom. We were put in lines. We had to march. They would take about 10 boys at a time, and we'd be marching to the mess hall. Another group would wait for their turn, and on that went. And on the other side, the girls were doing the same thing. The school itself had between 300 and 400 boys and girls. As I mentioned, ages about 5 to 13, and they were pretty much equally matched, girls and boys. Like Susan said, we were given metal trays and again told to line up for our meals. And as we went down the line, servers would put foods on our metal trays that did not look anything like what we were used to at home. You got to remember, we ate mostly traditional native foods, including greens and berries and fish and caribou and moose, a whole array of traditional native foods. And we didn't get any of that at Wrangell at all. It was, I can still remember looking in the back of the room in the mess hall there where the cooks were, opening large industrial sized cans of greasy salted meats, huge tins of salted vegetables, ultra sweet fruits, canned fruits. Like Susan said, we ate powdered eggs, drank powdered milk, powdered juice, commodity cheese, and it made us very ill because our bodies were not used to taking in these kind of foods. And there was a 2 or 3 week period where many of us rejected the foods we were eating, and we couldn't help it. We had upset stomachs, we had vomiting, we had diarrhea, and we soiled our clothing and we soiled our beds, and the matrons were pissed off. They were angry at us for soiling and on our sheets and our pants and our shorts, and making it to sound like we were the problem. And I don't think they really understood that what was going on was that we were simply reacting to the strange foods that we had to eat. A lot of children could not leave the mess table until they demonstrated to someone who was standing over them that they finally finished everything on their tray. And so that's kind of how the first number of weeks started. It's just like that. In the classroom, the most littlest ones, of course, were we were sent into these classrooms for learning our ABCs and our numbers, and it was all done by rote. We had to learn it all in English. And any child that was caught speaking their language in the classroom, in some of our classes where we had very strict teachers who used punishments like putting us into dark rooms in the classroom, hitting us with rulers, and a shaming one called putting on a dunce cap on a high stool in front of the class. These were all meant to shame us into speaking English. And whereas as I said, I already knew how to speak English, I hadn't I didn't have as much experience being punished for that, but I have certainly witnessed so many other children who had to go through that. Didn't take very long for a lot of the abuses of children started in the boys' dorm and in the girls' dorm also. In the boys' dorm, we had matrons that all had different levels of tolerance for either our behavior or speaking our language. And we were often spanked or whipped, paddled. And it escalated to a point where one particular year or two, I can still remember accumulating some demerits or something like that and having to run a gauntlet along with other boys who were forced to run this gauntlet of, and we had to do it naked. We had to be completely undressed. We had to walk and run up and down a row of children who were told to use their belts on us as we walked or ran down. And oftentimes we had to do this multiple times. It wasn't on one thing and you're done. It occurred multiple times. Some children had relatives and friends that they didn't, or they chose not to hit very hard. They just went through the motions. And under the watchful eyes of these matrons, they took us out of line and we had to get undressed and walk and run and up down the line ourselves. And it was an incentive to other children to hit us as hard as they could. Some used the buckle end on us, and it raised blood out of us on our backs. It became a spectator sport on occasion where teachers and administrators and other people would come and watch the spectacle of little naked kids, boys running up and down the line. Other times there was one particular matron who was fond of using a cat of nine tails paddle. It's a paddle with a thin paddle, wooden paddle with holes in it. And he loved to hit naked children as a part of the punishment he liked to give out. And sometimes he did it with so much anger and that blood blisters were raised on the back of our butts and our back of our arms and back and legs. So if you can imagine being hit so hard as to raise multiple blood blisters. And some of the kids that he thought were more egregious in their behavior or the way they spoke their language, or he would make sure that they really got it. One particular time I can still remember, well, a couple of times. One, when I was about 10 years old, I was wrestling with a friend who apparently violated this guy's sensibilities, and he forced us to undress and go naked into the shower room. And with his body, he covered the doorway, the open doorway, and he reached out to the side and pulled out a fire hose, and he turned it on us, on my friend and I. And this water was so cold, it was basically full of ice and snow. But the force of that water and the coldness of that was so devastating. I could barely breathe. I can still remember my friend screaming even louder than myself because cold water was getting into his infected eardrums. And all of a sudden he just stopped. Another time when I was about 12 years old, he hit another friend of mine so hard that he splayed his mouth open all the way up under his ear, and his whole side of his face fell open. And he was instantly unconscious. He was bleeding profusely, and he had this gaping wound in his face. He was taken to the hospital in the town of Wrangell, 5 miles away. And sometime later, he returned with his entire jaw wired shut, and all he could eat was through a straw. And my friend was a daily reminder for quite a few number of weeks while his jaw healed. That was a reminder that this particular matron could get away with anything. He was never fired. He was never arrested. He was never put in jail. He was never suspended. He never apologized. And I was only one of many children who witnessed this beating. And when you're that young and you see that kind of violence, it can't help but have an impact on your life going forward. Unfortunately, as we know, too often these boarding schools were a magnet for pedophiles. It attracted both men and women who love to sexually prey on children. And the boys' dorm and the girls' dorm were no different. We had girls going home in the middle of the school year that were pregnant from the constant rapes that were occurring. In the boys' dorm, many of us were sodomized in our bunks and also in the bathroom. And this occurred over time, and not only during the school year, but over the years that many of us were there. And so some of the children who were sexually molested as 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds were themselves molesting the younger ones when they got older. So I wanted to make sure that this was an example of the kind of abuses that we were experiencing, not only the physical abuse, but the sexual abuse. And I still remember being told, constantly reminded, that my mother was practicing satanic ways and worshiping the devil because she spoke her language and practiced many of her Inupiaq traditions. When you hear that often enough over the years, you start believing that. And I wanted to, tell you one example. When I was about 13 or 14, I would be okay with her at home, but I would purposefully avoid her in public in Fairbanks. If I saw her walking down the street, for example, I would go across the street just so that I wouldn't be seen with her. That was how much I incorporated all those things that I was being told about my mother. One particular time, I don't know how old I was, but I wrote a letter home telling my mother about the abuses that we were experiencing at Wrangell. And I still remember it didn't take very long to think that my mother didn't care, because she never responded and she never take any kind of action. And I do remember years later, when I was much older, she remembered a letter that she got. And she told me that a lot of the things I had said in that letter were blacked out. Today we say the word redacted. So in reality, we learned that the BIA was also censoring our correspondence and our mail, both coming in and going out. Um, and that kind of explained that kind of thing. Um, so we couldn't get away, we couldn't get away from the total institutional experience, even on campus. There was always people monitoring us. There were people that were employed. Other little kids would go rat on you and tell you or tell on you, and so it was really hard to just be yourself, and that was kind of like the first year. We saw a lot of over the years. Of course, I learned everything about American history and world history and some literature and some current events and of course learning math and some science, but never anything about who we were as Indigenous people, as Native people, as the Inupiaq. And after 10 years of boarding school myself, because I went on to another boarding school, which was a high school called Mount Edgecombe, they didn't encourage any of that is either, although we weren't punished for speaking our language at Mount Edgecombe. They never supported us practicing any of our traditional ways. I quickly lost a lot of the language I used to know from my mother. But more importantly, I think I lost who I was as a person, as an Indigenous kid, as a Native kid. I did not know who I was. I just did not have a clue. I should have learned all those things about traditional life had I not gone to boarding school. All the rites of passage, all the changes of the seasons, those were all taken away. And in fact, many of us as children lost our childhood as a result of boarding school. And many of us didn't know how to relate to our own families when we started having children, getting married, didn't know how to be, how to treat women, how to treat children. I found there was a lot of anger in my own personal life, in which I didn't understand where in the hell that was coming from. I abused my relationship with my wife and my children. I just did not know how to be. I was totally angry, and if it wasn't for my wife telling me that I needed to go get help, because I didn't know that I needed help, but I certainly wanted to keep my family together. So I went to counseling, and I went to therapy, and I went to talking circles, and I went to healing circles, and I went to Beauty for Ashes. And I think slowly but surely, all those things started creating awareness in my own behavior and my own experiences that I thought was normal. And I know I'm just one person out of thousands telling this story, because there was over 30 boarding schools set up all over Alaska, and Wrangell Institute was just one of them. But other boarding schools some of our Alaska children were sent in the lower 48, including Carlisle, Chilocco, and Chimawa, and Riverside. These were all examples of other boarding schools that Alaska children were sent to. And they all have varying degrees of their own trauma and story that many of my friends have shared with me. That is the reason I got so involved with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I wanted to become part of a group of people that wants to hold our government accountable for the policies that they had about forced assimilation and forced acculturation. I also want those churches that went along with that whole thing to acknowledge the role they played in that as well. Alaska is a little different in some cases than the lower 48 in that regards. We had an infamous guy here called Sheldon Jackson who formulated something called the Comity Plan, COMITY, where he went to New York City in the late 1880s and basically laid out a big map of invited different denominations to the meeting. And he basically assigned the different denominations to different parts of Alaska. Later, the Catholics Church participated. And when you Google the Comity Plan, you'll see a map that shows where many of the different denominations were located. There are Presbyterians, Episcopalians, there were Quakers, Covenants, there were Catholics, Moravians, Lutherans, Southern Baptist. They were all there doing the bidding of the U.S. government because the other part of Sheldon Jackson's legacy was that he firmly believed that Native people were savages, and he often used that term in his way of speaking and his writings, that they needed to be educated and to receive a Christian education because we needed to learn the Word of God and Jesus, and that our spiritual ways were evil and satanic. So if you add up the kinds of abuses we had, I think it included all of them: the physical, the sexual, the emotional, psychological abuse. And you compound that over the years that many of us were at these schools. It created a separation of families, one to each other. After 10 years of boarding school, I just never went home. I didn't think I had a home to go to. I was estranged from my mother. And that was, I think, by design. It took me a long time to understand that aspect of my life and to figure out why I was in all of this turmoil and being lost. And then you multiply that. Some families manage to reclaim their children in the summer enough to keep them going for the next year. And as some children were older, they had more of a resilience to and tolerance to being institutionalized than some of the youngest ones. So we've had a mixed experience. I'm really a firm believer in not only what NABS is doing, but I think therapists and counselors and they need to create an intake system where they need to gauge the history, the boarding school history of children, not only people my age, but it also is generational. So my mother was forced to go to a VIA day school in the 1920s and 30s, and she experienced her own trauma. I unfortunately visited some of my own trauma onto my own children and to our grandchildren. So I can see that as something we need. We need to have healing centers. We need to get language revitalization returned to us. We need some sort of way to get our government to acknowledge the role they played and find ways to bring us back to balance. Thank you.
Our final speaker for today's webinar is Josephine Chase. Josephine Chase is a consultant / director, First Nation Healing Incorporated, formal social work faculty with Oglala Lakota College. Dr. Chase has been the associate director of the Takini Network Institute, based in Rapid City, South Dakota, a Native collective devoted to community healing from intergenerational massive group trauma. Since 1992, she has collaborated in the development of the Historical Trauma and Unresolved Grief Intervention, HTUD, recognized as an exemplary model in a special minority initiative by the Center for Mental Health Services in 2001. Dr. Chase has extensive history providing direct practice and supervision in child welfare and mental health therapy with individuals, families, and groups, and experience in conducting behavioral health research. Dr. Chase grew up on a ranch on the Fort Berthold Reservation in western North Dakota and has a love for nature and the land, and recognizes the healing attributes of Mother Nature, Mother Earth, as well as the connection between mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical health. She is trained and certified in providing equine-assisted psychotherapy.
Ampetawashte, Machpia Bajawi, Imachiapie. Good afternoon. My Lakota name is Machpia Bajawi. My English name is Josephine Chase. I'm a PhD clinical social worker, and my background is I'm Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara on my father's side, and I'm Hunkpapa Nyanktane from the Standing Rock Reservation, both in North Dakota on my mother's side. I've been in the field of social work, practicing primarily in child welfare and mental health for the last, since I guess you would say the early 1980s. And the topic I want to address today is healing historical trauma and unresolved grief among American Indians and Alaska Natives. Much of my work has been conducted since 1992 with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who defined historical trauma and unresolved grief among Natives as the emotional and psychological wounding across generations from massive group trauma, and the unresolved grief accompanies that trauma. That includes the many losses of our people through genocide, governmental removal from our culture and language, the loss of our prohibition of our spiritual practices that were utilized for healing prior, as well as, other governmental policies and implementation of the reservation system, relocation, etc. So I just want to give a history of the work of Dr. Braveheart and myself throughout the years. Our initial work started in 1992 with an intervention based on her dissertation that basically was the initial model for the historical trauma and unresolved grief model that we call HTUG, HTUG. And we trained some grassroots community people who were involved in mental health and addiction recovery in the model. And that was the beginning of our journey in addressing HTUG. We've provided trainings and healing interventions across the United States and into Canada with great response to the model because it is steeped in our traditional Indigenous culture and healing methodologies, combined with Western's psychological knowledge and intervention as well. So our initial intent and mission was to help our people heal from the atrocities, the traumas that occurred over generations to, I guess, lead to many physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological illnesses in our communities today. And we wanted to do this in a culturally sensitive manner that would lead to, I guess, healing of generations. And we've developed, excuse me, interventions that start with individual healing as well as looking at, you know, our histories of our people, of our families, and personal traumatic experiences and trauma exposure as well. And we know that our people suffer overwhelming, I guess, effects of this phenomena across, you know, mental, spiritual, physical, and emotional hardships, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, as well as the physical effects, such as high rates of diabetes, heart disease, and obesity, to name a few. And I just wanted to talk about that first intervention in 1992 that has rippled out over these last nearly 40 years to Native communities where historical trauma has and unresolved grief has more of an awareness. I guess our communities are aware of the effects of the phenomenon and the effects in their communities. So initially we trained, you know, communities everywhere from the East Coast to the West Coast, the Southwest, and up into Canada in the model. So we recognized early on that many of the interventions were not well received or effective in Native communities. So it was our desire to change that, to recognize the importance of culture, of our tribal knowledge, and our tribal healing practices in helping our people in the healing process. In addition to the trainings, we participated in several projects that always required us to utilize practices that were evidence-based. And of course, many of those practices did not include, you know, Native people or in the study population or our cultural knowledge. And that's what we aim to do over time. So it's been a journey for us in getting that to the point where perhaps historical trauma and unresolved grief model would be evidence-based. And one intervention that we developed was an NIMH R34 study that we conducted in 2 sites, one in the Southwest in an urban population that had, you know, multi-tribal participants and across ages from 18 to 80, basically. And we also conducted the study at another site here in the Northern Plains in a rural reservation setting. And we feel that it's important for us to contribute clinically as well as to research and to write our own stories and findings about our experiences and the opportunities for healing in Indian country. We found a significant reduction in depression and anxiety and PTSD in our populations at both sites. And we also found that it was often the first opportunity for participants to address the traumas of boarding school experience, adoption, removal from their families or their tribes, and to do it in a setting with other Native people, which really lent to group cohesion and sharing, which we know often Native people are very private in sharing their traumatic experiences. And so that was conducted in 2016, 13 through 16. And we trained Native providers in the model and had Native clinical staff providing the intervention at 2 sites. And the name of the study was Inwankapia, American Indian Pilot Clinical Trial, Historical Trauma and Group. And we published our findings with that so that other people can reference that resource. We also published a paper regarding conducting research in Indigenous communities, and we published a paper from the research aspect called Historical Trauma Among Indigenous Peoples of the Americas, Concepts, Research, and Clinical Considerations, which really raises the strengths as well as the challenges in conducting clinical research in Indian communities. And as we know, we're limited in resources. We have challenges of distance, of geographical distance, and economics and other concerns that affect conducting research in our Native communities. I also would like to just share a little bit about kind of I guess I would say, fortuitous conference that we provided or offered in 2001 from September 4th through the 8th, which was called Models for Indigenous Survivors of Historical Trauma, a multicultural dialogue among allies. And that was, again, in 2001. We brought clinicians from massively traumatized groups such as African Americans, Latinos, Japanese Americans, Holocaust therapists together to talk about the unique needs of Indigenous populations and treatment. And it was a great success. And as I said, I got home after this conference to the incident of the World Trade Center, or 9/11, just immediately following that conference, which really highlighted the need for trauma healing, even on a larger scale. So, another intervention that we developed around historical trauma and unresolved grief was a parenting curriculum that we conducted on in a reservation setting, where we trained facilitators in a parenting model. And the crux of that was that we adapted a parenting model that was developed by Dr. Marilyn Steele, an African-American psychologist, who gave us permission to adapt her model that was a strengths-based model to integrate historical trauma. That is now being modified and will be produced and supported through the University of New Mexico, and it's called TRIBES, TRIBES. And we hope that that will become an evidence-based parenting model. I would also like to say that the HTUG model, which looks at understanding trauma and recognizing the impact that it has on individuals and communities, and also an awareness of their own personal, family, and community trauma, and then working through that trauma to transcend or overcome the trauma so that people can go forward in a positive way, knowing that there were reasons or situations, incidents that affected their health and well-being, and kind of externalizes the effects instead of blaming themselves for depression or other mental health issues. The model has been adapted and really continues to this day to be utilized in some communities that we worked with, such as the Cherokee tribe in North Carolina and in Alaska as well, and even utilized in the school systems. Even though we're working still towards the point of becoming evidence-based, it's from our experience, is effective with many Native communities across the United States and in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this webinar on historical trauma among Indigenous peoples of Americas in the Fireside Chat webinar series. We were honored by our speakers to gain expert insights and firsthand experiences on this important topic.